He was just an old janitor with no rank, no voice, shoved straight into a weight rack in the middle of a SEAL gym. "Move," Carter snapped, grabbing his shirt, metal clashing loud and sharp. A young officer who had just failed his qualification test was dumping his anger on the weakest person in the room, and no one spoke up. In that moment, Jonas was treated like trash, an invisible obstacle, someone who didn't deserve to exist there. But only seconds later, in one very brief moment, everything flipped. A sleeve tore open, and an old tattoo appeared. Commander Hale walked in and halted right at the doorway. No alarm, no command, just a look strong enough to freeze the entire room. The ones who had been laughing fell silent. The one who had lashed out started to feel a chill down his spine. Jonas wasn't an outsider. He wasn't an ordinary janitor. The tattoo on his arm was the mark of a secret unit that once handled training deaths that never made it into the reports honestly. And behind Hale, Deputy Commander Rudd knew that better than anyone, because he was the one who had signed off on an altered report to bury the truth. If you were Jonas, would you step forward and speak up, or stay silent so no one else would have to pay the price? If this part gave you chills, hit subscribe right now. Comment below whether you would stand up or turn away, because this isn't just a story, it's a test of who we are. The SEAL training room began its morning like every day, with nothing suggesting that its familiar order was about to be touched. That space always operated on a fixed rhythm, early enough for the body to still be sleepy, steady enough that no one had to think. Everything here existed to serve discipline, and discipline didn't like being questioned. Jonas stepped in through the side door, a door that very few people noticed, because it wasn't tied to any ritual. He was used to this. His hand on the door handle didn't hesitate, didn't slow, as if his body remembered the way without needing awareness. The floor scrubber rolled behind him, giving off its familiar dry sound, the sound early trainees often heard, but rarely looked toward. Jonas had worked here for many years. No one remembered exactly how long. He appeared before some people in this room had been assigned to the unit, and he was still here when several of them had already transferred out. His name was written on the personnel list, but it was rarely called. Jonas had no rank. That made him an odd point among people who lived by hierarchy and symbols. A group of young SEALs was warming up near the dumbbells. They talked quietly enough not to break the morning, but they didn't lower their voices when Jonas walked past. One glanced at his watch, then tilted his head toward Jonas, saying in a half-joking, half-curious tone that the man always arrived before any of them. There was no malice in that remark, but also no friendliness. It was simply a comment, and in this place, comments drifted away as quickly as they were spoken. Jonas nodded in greeting, a familiar gesture, just enough to show he had heard. No one responded. The silence wasn't contempt, nor an intentional ignoring. It was simply part of the routine. Jonas was used to it. He pushed the scrubber on, cleaning each section of floor with the focus of someone doing work that wasn't allowed to have mistakes, even if almost no one paid attention. The security camera mounted on the ceiling turned slightly, tracking movement in the room. The motion was slow and steady, like the eye of an emotionless creature. In the frame, Jonas appeared, then drifted out of view, giving way to bodies warming up through their exercises. The system recorded everything, making no distinction about who was more important. In the technical room, a small screen displayed lines of data running across. It was a place rarely watched for long, because most of the time everything worked as programmed. A young technician, who was used to the indicators jumping around in repeating patterns, suddenly froze. A log line had appeared and then disappeared too quickly to be called a warning, but different enough to make him frown. He leaned closer to the screen, scrolling back a few lines. The system made no sound, no red signals, no urgent notifications, just a small sign, like a heartbeat skipping for a moment and then returning to normal. The technician told himself it was probably just a brief data read error, the kind large systems sometimes encounter. He turned to the colleague next to him, saying he had just seen a slightly strange signal, but it might have vanished. The other glanced at the screen, shrugged, and said that if there was no alert, then leave it. Here, everything was designed to remove what wasn't necessary. Doubt was the same. In the gym, no one stopped. The sound of weights hitting the floor, the sound of shoes against the rubber surface, and the steady breathing continued. The morning still moved along its familiar path. Jonas cleaned the last area of the locker row, bending down to gather the remaining watermarks, careful as if every centimeter of floor mattered. Some people in the room had never looked at Jonas for more than a few seconds. To them, he was part of the background, like the lights or the metallic smell in the air. Jonas didn't try to change that. He arrived, did his work, then left. No questions, no complaints. That habit had helped him exist in a place where attention could become a burden. An older SEAL, one who had trained here long enough to notice small details, glanced briefly at Jonas as he passed. The look held no curiosity, only a vague recognition, like seeing a familiar object without needing to name it. The man returned to his exercise right away. In the technical room, the young technician was still thinking about the earlier log line. He opened another inspection window, quickly scanning recent activities. Everything looked fine. No unauthorized access was marked. No ports activated outside their schedule. He quietly laughed at himself, thinking he had been too sensitive. The base's security system was built not to miss anything. It remembered things people didn't pay attention to, and it could also remain silent when it wasn't time to speak. That data line had been stored, placed into a long chain of information no one actively looked for. It lay there like a small scratch on a metal surface, not deep enough to draw attention, but not completely gone either. Jonas finished the first round of floor cleaning, placing the scrubber neatly in its corner. He straightened his back for a moment, rubbing his wrist as if to push away the familiar numbness. The lights above highlighted the wrinkles on his face, the marks of time he didn't hide. Jonas looked around the room, not searching for anyone in particular, only checking if any spot needed more work. A burst of laughter came from the group of young SEALs when one of them told a short story. The sound rose and faded, blending into the routine. Jonas bent down and continued his work. He didn't know, and had no reason to know, that the moment he stepped through the side door that morning, the system had recorded something that later wouldn't be ignored. In the technical room, the technician moved on to another task. The screen before him returned to its familiar state, numbers running evenly, with nothing standing out. That log line had drifted downward, covered by new activity. It was still there, stored exactly as the system was designed to store it. No alarm sounded. No one told anyone to stop training. The morning continued, looking exactly like hundreds of mornings before. But deep within the system, a signal had been recorded, silent and precise, waiting for the moment it would have to be seen. The sound rang out like a direct hit to a routine that had been programmed too familiarly. The alarm ripped through the gym space, long and sharp, forcing every movement to stop in mid-motion. Hands holding weights froze. Feet that were moving stood still. No one needed to be reminded that this was not a scheduled test. Right after that, the steel doors began to close. Not one door, but several layers in succession, each clang of metal hitting the frame heavy and final. Each time they closed, the space tightened, making the once wide room feel more confined, more sealed. A few people stepped back by reflex. Others lifted their heads toward the ceiling as if looking for an explanation in the most familiar things. "What the hell is this?" a SEAL blurted out, his voice mixed with irritation and surprise. The sentence came out naturally, needing no answer, but it opened a line of tension spreading quickly through the room. Jonas stood against the east wall, where he had stopped after parking the floor scrubber. His hand still held the broom handle, his fingers tightening by habit whenever a loud sound rose. He didn't turn his head yet. Jonas was used to letting things continue for a few beats before deciding where he should stand in an unusual situation. In the security area, the duty officer jumped from his chair, eyes stuck to the screen that was shifting colors. He spoke quickly, his voice higher than normal. "There's unauthorized access." The way he stressed the last word showed this was not a false alert. Another technician pulled his chair close to the control panel, skimming the new data lines. He shook his head as soon as he saw the access code, then said, "Not a normal card. It's an old generation card." His voice lowered at the last words, as if he himself didn't like what they implied. An officer nearby turned and asked directly, "How old is old?" The question was short, clear, and without extra emotion. "More than 8 years, the technician answered. After a beat, checking the screen again, the number was spoken firmly, needing no further explanation. The space in the gym seemed to slow a little. 8 years was long enough to change an entire generation of service members. It didn't belong to the present, and it wasn't something easily brushed aside like routine technical errors. Another person in the tech room lowered his voice, leaning toward the officers nearby, saying, "Those cards are tied to deleted files." The sentence was kept quiet enough not to carry through the entire room, but clear enough for the people who needed to hear it. Jonas turned his head now. He didn't look toward the tech room but along the people scattered throughout the gym. There were familiar faces he had seen every morning, and also new ones. Their eyes were beginning to shift, from surprise to scrutiny, from scrutiny to calculation. A supervising officer held up a hand, signaling everyone to stay in place. He said the lockdown protocol was being activated, asking everyone to remain still until further notice. His voice tried to stay calm, but tension leaked through in how he paused between sentences. Jonas moved his feet slightly, pressing himself closer to the wall. It was the reflex of someone who didn't want to obstruct, didn't want to become an obstacle in moments when order was needed. His hand still held tightly to the broom handle, like a small anchor when everything around him was becoming harder to predict. The list of people present in the gym was read out. Each name was spoken and confirmed quickly. When they reached Jonas, the reader's voice did not change pace, but several eyes turned toward him. Jonas nodded in confirmation, saying nothing except that he had been here since early morning. Like every day, a young SEAL glanced at his watch, then at Jonas, saying to the person next to him that the man always arrived very early. The sentence was spoken softly, but in this silence, it sounded clearer than necessary. The other didn't reply immediately, only frowned, thinking. In the tech room, the technician continued scanning the system logs. He enlarged a section of data, pointed to the screen, saying the activation signal happened extremely fast. He hadn't said the exact time yet, but the way he looked at the others showed this wasn't a detail that could be ignored. The security officer asked a few more questions, his voice lower than before, requesting confirmation of the access source. The answer made several people in the room tighten their jaws. The signal came from inside the lockdown area, not from outside. That meant the person who activated the card was inside the room. No one spoke that conclusion aloud, but it appeared clearly in everyone's eyes. A few SEALs instinctively looked around, reassessing the people near them. These looks didn't hold hostility, but they were sharper, more focused. A young officer stepped forward, asking Jonas which door he had used this morning. His voice remained neutral, but his eyes did not leave Jonas. Jonas replied that he had entered through the side door, the route he had always used during his time working here. He spoke slowly, clearly, without trying to explain further. The side door was the detail that caused the exchange to pause for a brief moment. It wasn't unusual, but it also wasn't something everyone paid attention to each day. The security staff noted it down without reacting further. Another person asked Jonas whether he had seen anyone else come in earlier. Jonas thought for a moment, then shook his head, saying he had not seen anyone. The answer was simple, but in this context, its simplicity raised more questions. The technician finally stated the exact activation time. The access card had been activated within a very short window, not long enough to perform any normal access operation. The information made several people exchange looks. It stirred the feeling that this was not an accidental action. Jonas felt clearly the change in the way people looked at him. Those eyes had not reached a conclusion yet, but they carried the first trace of suspicion. He stood still, hand gripping the broom handle, shoulders drawing inward slightly, as if giving space for everything moving around him. In that moment, Jonas understood that he had stepped across an invisible boundary. This morning had shifted in another direction. The first look of suspicion had appeared, quiet but clear, and it was searching for a place to hold on. The silence after the lockdown announcement lasted longer than usual. It wasn't quiet in a comfortable way, but heavy, as if everyone was holding back a thought they didn't want to say yet. Eyes still drifted toward Jonas, then away, then back again. No one stood clearly on any side. Everything was in a waiting state, and that state itself made some people uneasy. Carter was one of them. He stood in the second row, near the free weight area, his shoulders still tight from the warm-up that had been cut short. The recent evaluation still weighed on his mind. One small mistake, one beat slower than the standard, and the name Carter wasn't on the list of those who passed. He had heard enough encouraging words. Enough. Talk about doing better next time. But this morning, everything returned to a familiar point. The feeling of being judged, being watched. When the gym was locked down, that feeling came back, clearer. Carter stepped out of the row, one firm step. His voice sounded out, not too loud, but loud enough for everyone to hear. Who's allowed to be here before opening time? The question was asked more like a challenge than a request for information. No one answered. A few people looked down at the floor, and others looked toward the tech room where the screens were still lit. The silence made Carter more irritated. He hated the feeling of speaking and getting no response. Hated when his question drifted away, as if it had never existed. Carter turned toward Jonas, his gaze locked onto him, as if he had finally found a place to land. You. One single word, short enough to pull Jonas into the center of the room. Jonas didn't react immediately. He looked at Carter, his expression calm, carrying no challenge. When he spoke, his voice was slow and steady. I always work this shift. The answer was simple, familiar, like the way he always replied whenever someone asked about his schedule. Carter let out a short laugh. It wasn't loud, but enough to make a few people frown. Always. Huh? Or just today? The way he pressed the last word made the question carry a sharper suspicion. A SEAL standing near Carter tilted his head, whispering, "Drop it, Carter." The voice was low enough not to break order, but clear enough to show someone wasn't comfortable with where the conversation was heading. Carter flicked his hand, cutting off the interruption. Quiet. I'm asking him. The words came out fast and sharp, leaving no room for anyone to step in. In that moment, Carter wasn't looking for agreement. He just needed somewhere to unload the pressure building inside him. Jonas stayed still. He could feel clearly the change in Carter's gaze. It was no longer curiosity or vague suspicion. It carried personal frustration. Frustration, looking for somewhere to fall. Jonas had seen that kind of look before. In other places, at other times, he knew when to speak and when to keep his words to a minimum. Carter stepped forward again. The distance between them shrank. A few other SEALs adjusted their stance, as if preparing for something that might happen. No one spoke, but the attention of the whole room had shifted here. Which door did you use? Carter asked, his voice no longer holding the neutrality it had at first. The side door, Jonas answered, like every day. The side door, Carter repeated, turning his head, as if wanting others to hear it too. An entrance few people pay attention to. He paused, letting the words hang. That's enough. An older officer stepped forward half a step, raising his hand. Carter, hold your position. His voice was low, not loud, but carried enough authority to make several people turn. Carter glanced at the man who had spoken, then looked back at Jonas. He didn't directly disobey, but he didn't step back either. I'm just asking what needs to be asked, he said, his voice lower now, but still tense. Jonas drew a light breath. He didn't want this conversation to stretch on. He added, still evenly, that he had worked here for many years. His schedule never changed, and he didn't have an access card. The sentences weren't meant to persuade, only to place the situation back where it belonged. Carter listened, but showed no sign he was taking it in. In his mind, pieces were arranging themselves into a pattern that suited his feelings. An old generation card activated, a man without rank, a side door, and a morning where everything had slipped out of his control. Another SEAL spoke up, this time clearly. We're waiting for security to conclude. The words were a reminder, not an order. Carter turned toward him. I know what we're waiting for. Then he turned back to Jonas. But while we wait, I want to know why you're here earlier than everyone else. Jonas looked straight at Carter. He didn't avoid the gaze, but he didn't move forward either. Because that's my job, he said. I come early to clean before everyone trains. That answer, instead of calming things down, made Carter curl his lip slightly. Sounds nice, he said, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. But today isn't normal, right? Jonas replied. Today isn't normal. Jonas's words made a few people look up in surprise. They weren't confrontational, but they weren't pure submission either. Carter paused for a brief beat, as if weighing something. Silence returned, short but clear. In that moment, Carter felt the eyes of others on his back. He knew he was being watched, knew that every word now could be remembered later. But the frustration from his earlier failure made it hard for him to back down. Carter stepped forward once more, standing very close to Jonas. Close enough for Jonas to feel his breath, close enough for the entire room to understand. The situation had crossed the line of a normal questioning. You should answer more clearly, Carter said, his voice low. Here, everything needs to be clear. Jonas looked at Carter, his expression unchanged. He didn't step back. He didn't step forward. He stood there, broom in hand, while the first spark of suspicion had shifted into a confrontation. And as Carter moved in close, the entire room held its breath, as if waiting for something about to happen. The distance between Carter and Jonas was now close enough for the people around them to feel the tension spreading like a cold current. No one still thought this was a proper procedural questioning. The restraint taught since the first day of training was being stretched to a fragile limit. Carter leaned forward, eyes fixed on Jonas. He spoke a few more sentences, his voice low but sharp, circling the side door. The work schedule, things that should have been small details. Jonas listened, answering briefly. Each reply kept to the minimum. He didn't argue, but he didn't step back either. That calmness in Carter's eyes felt like a silent challenge. An officer standing nearby stepped forward half a step, raising a hand to signal stop. He said everything was being handled and told Carter to keep his distance. The reminder came too late. Carter was already in a state where all sounds from outside had gone dim. Move, Carter said, his voice suddenly louder, like a command thrown out by reflex. His hand pushed hard into Jonas's chest. Jonas didn't adjust his stance in time. He lost balance, stepping back once and then again, his heel catching the edge of the weight rack behind him. The impact came unexpectedly. His back hit the metal, the sound cracking through the room, dry and sharp, making several people turn in surprise. That sound cut across every unfinished thought in the room. A few SEALs stepped forward by reflex, but froze when they saw Carter still standing close to Jonas. The moment happened too fast for anyone to wedge themselves in. Jonas tried to stand straight, his hand gripping the rack to steady himself. Before he could say anything, Carter grabbed his sleeve and pulled. It was a rough gesture, carrying frustration that hadn't been released. The old fabric couldn't withstand the force. A short tearing sound echoed. The sleeve slipped down, revealing a part of the forearm usually kept hidden. In that moment, the room seemed to freeze. On Jonas's forearm was an old tattoo. The ink had faded over the years, the lines still sharp, with no name, no number, no familiar emblem from any unit these people had ever seen. It didn't resemble common personal tattoos, nor commemorative markings. It existed like a symbol, simple and cold. Carter released his grip by reflex, as if he had touched something he shouldn't. He stared at Jonas's forearm, his expression shifting faster than he could control. The anger paused, replaced by a nameless confusion. A nearby SEAL leaned in slightly. Trying to see clearly, he whispered, low but loud enough for a few to hear. That tattoo, what is it? No one answered. Not because they didn't want to, but because no one was sure what they were seeing. People who had gone through years of training, who had seen countless symbols, suddenly felt this one didn't belong to any category they knew. Jonas pulled the sleeve down instinctively, covering the exposed skin. The motion was quick, neat, as if he had done it many times before. He straightened, his back still brushing the weight rack, his eyes passing over the faces staring at him. Carter stepped back half a step. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped. The questions he had thrown, the accusations he had made, suddenly felt misplaced. He realized he had crossed a boundary he couldn't even name. An older officer stepped forward, his voice deep and firm. He told everyone to hold their positions, then turned to Carter, saying that what he had done was unacceptable. Carter listened, but his eyes stayed on Jonas's arm, as if the symbol were still visible, despite being covered. The atmosphere in the room changed completely. The initial suspicion, once vague, had shifted into a kind of curiosity mixed with caution. The tattoo didn't answer the question about the access card, but it opened another one, deeper and more unsettling. Jonas drew a slow breath. He said he was fine, that there was no need to escalate. His voice was steady, without reproach. That alone confused several people. They were used to forceful reactions to confrontation, and this calmness left them unsure where to place it. Another SEAL whispered to a teammate that the symbol looked like something much older than anything they had been taught. The other didn't reply, only looked at Jonas again, his gaze heavy with thought. Carter finally spoke, his voice lowered. He said he only wanted to clarify the situation, that everyone was tense. The sentence sounded like a clumsy excuse, even to himself. Jonas gave a slight nod, offering no comment. He pulled his sleeve straight, adjusting the fabric to cover his wrist fully. The motion was decisive, like a period ending the moment, but that period didn't erase the image burned into the minds of those who had seen it. A few people exchanged glances, tiny nods. They didn't speak, but it was clear the incident had gone far beyond a simple security concern. The tattoo felt like a piece of the past surfacing without being invited, but impossible to ignore. Footsteps sounded from the gym entrance. The sound was different from the familiar steps inside, slower, heavier, carrying the weight of authority. The door opened, the hinge giving a quiet creak. Many eyes turned toward it at once, abandoning their half-formed thoughts about the tattoo, about Jonas, about Carter. As the door opened, the entire room held its breath, as if someone had just turned an invisible lock, preparing to open another layer of truth. The gym door opened fully, revealing the figure standing in the doorway. Commander Hale didn't step in immediately. He stopped right at the entrance, as if an invisible force held him for a brief moment. The light from inside cast over his face, sharpening features long familiar with discipline and quick decisions. But in this moment, Hale did not move. No one in the room said anything. The silence spread by reflex, like the way a familiar room instantly shifts when a commanding officer appears. Carter stood slightly forward, his arm still tense from what had just happened. Jonas stood against the weight rack, his sleeve pulled down again, but his position remained the center of eyes that had not fully looked away. Hale's gaze swept the room out of habit. He saw where the group stood, saw Carter, saw the disruption in the normally neat order. Then his gaze stopped, not on Carter, not on the officers waiting for instructions. It stopped on Jonas's arm, where the fabric had only recently been pulled down. Hale took one more step inside. His steps were slow, steady, making no unnecessary sound. The distance between him and Jonas remained, but his eyes were already locked. He looked longer than needed, long enough for the people nearby to realize something was wrong. Not an outsider, Hale said quietly. The sentence wasn't directed at anyone specific, but it sounded clear in the silent room. His voice was deep, low, not a conclusion, more like a confirmation to himself. Carter turned to Hale, then to Jonas, confusion written plainly on his face. A few other SEALs exchanged glances. They didn't yet understand what that sentence referred to. To them, Jonas was still just the janitor who had been pulled into a security incident. Behind Hale, Deputy Commander Rudd entered at the same moment. He normally carried a calm demeanor, but the instant he followed Hale's gaze, his body stiffened, his shoulders tightened for a very brief beat, quick enough for most people to miss, but clear enough for himself to notice. Rudd's eyes stopped on Jonas, more precisely, on the place of the forearm that had just been covered. His face paled for a fraction of a second before he forced it back to normal. A bead of sweat slid from his temple, slow and distinct, even though the room's temperature hadn't changed. Hale didn't turn to look at Rudd. He remained where he stood, eyes fixed on Jonas. A different kind of silence was forming, no longer the silence of waiting, but the silence of recognition. A SEAL near the gym door, someone who had watched from the start but hadn't spoken, finally asked. His voice stayed respectful, but he couldn't hide his curiosity. "Sir, do you know that symbol?" The question broke through the heavy layer of silence. Several people turned to Hale, waiting for an explanation. Others looked back at Jonas, as if trying to reconstruct the image they had briefly seen under the torn fabric. Hale didn't answer immediately. He didn't say he knew it, nor did he say he didn't. He only looked at Jonas again, slowly, deeply, carrying something heavier than curiosity. In that gaze were memory, assessment, and caution. Jonas stayed still. He could feel that Hale's gaze was entirely different from the ones before. It didn't bring suspicion, and it didn't carry surface-level scrutiny. It felt like the gaze of someone who had seen this before, somewhere else. In another circumstance, Rudd swallowed hard behind him. He shifted his foot, unconsciously, stepping half a step back, a small gesture, almost unnoticed, but it betrayed his inner state. It was the reflex of someone who had just recognized something he once believed buried very deep. Carter now fully sensed the change in the air. He looked from Hale to Rudd, then back at Jonas. The questions he had earlier suddenly felt unimportant. He felt he had stumbled into a story that didn't belong to him, something far beyond the scope of this morning. Another officer spoke, trying to keep his voice steady. He asked whether this had any connection to the access card incident. The question was reasonable, procedural, but no one answered immediately. Hale finally turned his eyes away from Jonas, looking toward the tech room. He requested a quick report on the access situation. His voice returned to the rhythm of a commander handling an incident, but those who paid attention could tell his focus had shifted. The security staff repeated the information, trying to keep their voice even. The old generation access card had been activated for a very short time, and the signal originated inside the lockdown area. Hale listened carefully to every sentence, but his eyes occasionally returned to Jonas, as if the two streams of information were linking themselves inside his mind. Rudd stood still, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked at the floor for a moment, then raised his head, trying to keep a neutral expression, but the sweat remained. A SEAL standing nearby noticed it, glanced at a teammate, then back at Rudd. That recognition didn't yet have a name, but it was forming. Hale asked a few more short questions about how long the system had been updated, and how old files were processed. The technician answered each, unaware that every response was tightening something inside the man standing behind Hale. Jonas wasn't questioned. No one asked him to explain the tattoo, and no one mentioned the violent moment that had just occurred. The silence around him became different. It no longer carried suspicion, but felt like a temporary space where people were waiting to see what would be named first. A young SEAL whispered to the person next to him that this janitor didn't seem simple. The comment was quickly swallowed when Hale turned his head, his gaze sweeping over them. No verbal warning was given, but it was enough to make everyone quiet. Hale turned back to face Jonas. He looked at him longer than before, then gave a very slight nod, like a silent acknowledgement. Jonas noticed it, but didn't respond. He only stood a little straighter, letting his hand loosen from the broom handle. Rudd saw that nod. A chill ran down his spine. That symbol, that gaze, Hale's earlier words together, they formed a picture he had tried to forget long ago. A picture tied to reports that had been edited, signatures placed in silence. Hale said nothing more about the tattoo. He signaled another officer to take over maintaining order in the gym. instructing everyone to hold position until further direction. His voice was calm, firm, showing no emotion. Rudd stood behind him, stepping back another half step, as if trying to put distance between himself and Hale's gaze. The distance was small, but to Rudd, it felt like a survival reflex. He knew this moment wasn't over. It had only just begun, and he was standing on the edge of something he no longer controlled. The room fell silent again. This time, the silence carried the weight of a past, recognized by exactly one person, and recognized differently by one more. Jonas stood there, as quiet as before, but everything around him had changed, and in Rudd's eyes, fear was now clearly visible. As he unconsciously stepped back, half a step, like someone who had just seen a door he didn't want to open. After Hale's brief nod, the room fell into a strange state. No one focused fully on Jonas anymore, yet no one dared look away from him. Attention felt suspended, waiting for a new direction to fall. Hale was the one who would determine that direction. He turned away, pulling his gaze from Jonas, and walked toward the technical area. His movement was firm, carrying no gesture that suggested he would question the janitor further. A few people noticed this, exchanged glances, then quietly adjusted their posture, as if reminded that the focal point had shifted. Hale stopped in front of the main screen. He didn't need an introduction or explanation. His voice was low and steady as he spoke to the nearest technician. "Show me the detailed log." The sentence was short, but clear enough for the room to understand that guessing time was over. The technician swallowed, nodded, and placed his hands on the keyboard. The data lines were recalled, stacked in chronological order. The screen brightened, reflecting on the faces gathered around it. They moved closer by instinct, but still kept their distance, as if afraid to touch something that shouldn't be touched. Jonas stood where he was. He was not called, nor asked to move. That alone confused a few people. They were used to the person at the center of suspicion being questioned first. Hale's ignoring Jonas made some initial assumptions begin to shake. The technician entered a few more commands. The screen switched to another window. A name appeared on the top line. Next to it, the status, Kia. The words showed clearly, coldly, carrying no explanation. A seal behind them blurted out, "He died in training." The sentence slipped out by reflex, carrying the weight of late recognition. A few others nodded. They remembered, too. The name had once been mentioned, then faded out of everyday talk. Hale stared at the screen. He didn't ask anything yet. He let the silence do its work. In that silence, scattered memories began piecing themselves together in a few minds. A training session, a report, a name noted down and filed away. The technician spoke softly, his voice lower than before. This account should have been deleted. The way he stressed the last word gave his sentence a weight far heavier than the previous information. This was no longer a routine system error. Hale turned and asked briefly about the activation time. The technician pointed to a number on the screen. The log flashed the value 0, 8 seconds. The number appeared clearly, needing no enlargement. A few people exchanged looks. That time span was too short for any valid access operation, yet long enough for the system to register. It felt more like a touch than a use, and that touch made everyone uneasy, because it carried intention, Hale said, his voice still steady. Not a random error. The sentence wasn't loud, but it shut down any attempt to blame a technical malfunction. A few officers exhaled, as if accepting something they didn't want to accept. Jonas heard the sentence. He didn't react outwardly, but he understood its meaning. The system had begun speaking in place of people, and when the system spoke, the things once hidden behind paperwork would not stay hidden. Hale asked the technician to pull the full history of the account. Previous logins, minor status changes, everything appeared on the screen. Each line of data was a fragment, and Hale read them with the focus of someone used to finding what mattered among countless details. Rudd stood behind him, a few steps away. He maintained a proper stance, hands clasped in front of him. To an outside observer, he looked composed, but sweat still clung to his temple. His gaze avoided the screen, then returned, as if unsure where to look. Another seal asked, carefully, why a Kia account still existed in the system. The question came at the right moment, but there was no easy answer. The technician explained that by protocol, the account should be fully deleted once the file is finalized. Keeping such an account required manual intervention. Not everyone had the authority to do that. Hale turned his head, his gaze passing over the officers around him. then stopping on Rudd. He did not say Rudd's name, nor ask him anything directly, but the look was clear enough for the room to understand that the focus had shifted again. All eyes moved toward Rudd. The shift happened slowly, one person at a time, but when complete, Rudd stood in the center of a silent circle of attention. He felt it before he dared look up. Rudd raised his chin, trying to keep calm. He said this might be an oversight during system handovers, and there had been many staff changes in previous years. His voice sounded reasonable, but lacked its usual certainty. Hale didn't interrupt. He let Rudd finish, then turned back to the screen. He asked the technician who had the authority to retain or activate such an account. The list of permissions appeared. It wasn't long or complex, but it was very specific. One name on the list matched the position Rudd had held at that time. No one needed to point it out. Those standing close had already seen it. Rudd felt his throat drying. He swallowed, then added that he didn't remember every individual case, that there had been pressure, and many decisions had to be made quickly. His explanation wasn't wrong, but it didn't touch the real issue. Hale looked at Rudd again, more directly this time. His eyes held no anger, no judgment. They looked like the eyes of someone who had just confirmed what he had suspected. Jonas stood quietly. He watched the scene with unusual calm. He wasn't the one being named, but he knew he was the reason this series of events had taken this direction. The tattoo on his arm, even hidden again, felt like an anchor keeping the past from drifting. A young SEAL whispered to his teammate that this was going much further than a morning incident. The other nodded, saying nothing. Everyone felt that this was no longer about an access card. Hale asked one more question: when was the account last accessed before today? The technician answered that no activity had been recorded for many years. That long silence made the 0.8-second activation even more suspicious. Rudd looked down at the floor, then up again. He knew every answer the system delivered was shrinking the space for his explanations. He had believed the old decisions were buried deep enough. The system had just proven the opposite. Hale took a slow step toward Rudd. No one stopped him. No one spoke. He said he needed to separate Rudd for clarification of certain system-related matters. His tone stayed professional, but the implication was clear. Rudd nodded, slower than usual. His legs felt heavier, as if each step back cost more effort than the one before. He realized that the looks from those around him had changed. The automatic respect for a deputy commander had shifted into caution. All eyes stayed on Rudd as he stepped out of the circle of attention. He didn't need to turn around to know this moment marked a new boundary. In his mind, old reports, signatures written in silence, began surfacing more clearly than ever. Rudd knew he had just been exposed. After Rudd was told to step aside, the room fell into a silence, completely different from before. No more noise, and no more scattered suspicious looks. Attention now had a center, and strangely, that center was not on Jonas. Hale stood before the large screen, opening each section of the file displayed. He scrolled slowly with the mouse, reading carefully, pausing at a few lines before moving on. Every action he made happened as if Jonas didn't exist in the room. He didn't turn toward him, didn't ask, didn't request clarification. That confused people more than the earlier discoveries. Jonas stayed where he was, his back resting lightly on the weight rack. He didn't step forward, and he didn't step back. His eyes faced Hale, neither avoiding nor seeking protection. He was used to being looked at, and also used to being overlooked. This time, being overlooked carried a different meaning. Carter watched everything with growing frustration. He had been waiting for a question directed at Jonas, a direct challenge. Anything to prove his initial suspicion hadn't been pointless. When Hale continued reviewing data without glancing at Jonas even once, Carter frowned. "You're not going to question him," Carter spoke up. His voice wasn't as sharp as before, but it still carried the tension that hadn't been released. A few eyes turned toward Carter, then quickly shifted back to Hale. The question wasn't disrespectful, but it broke a deliberate layer of silence. Hale stopped his hand on the mouse, but still didn't turn his head. He answered briefly, his voice low and even. "I am questioning the system." The sentence closed the matter, leaving no room for debate. Carter opened his mouth as if to continue, then stopped. He realized this wasn't the moment to push further. The certainty in Hale's tone showed he had already chosen where to focus. Jonas heard the answer clearly. He didn't look relieved, nor more worried. His expression remained calm, as if he had expected this. He understood that when a seasoned commander chose not to ask, it was never an oversight. Hale told the technician to dig deeper into the account's history. The screen changed to more detailed sections, rows of data stretching across years. The technician explained each part, his voice more cautious than before. He said the account wasn't just left in the system, it had been actively maintained. Someone deliberately kept this account active. The technician said, After reviewing the edit entries, the sentence rang out clearly, no longer speculation. A wave of silence spread, deliberately meant a human decision, not a machine glitch. That made every gaze naturally drift toward the person who could have done it. Rudd straightened slightly, cleared his throat. It may be an old handover mistake, he said. The system has gone through several transitions. Not everything from those years was fully documented. His voice still carried outer calm, but lacked its usual firmness. A few SEALs looked at him, then at Hale, waiting for a reaction. Hale finally turned. His eyes stopped on Rudd, directly, with no evasion. "Mistakes don't last 8 years, Hale said. His voice wasn't loud, but each word was clear, leaving no doubt. Rudd pressed his lips together. He meant to say more, but found no suitable sentence. Any explanation now risked sounding like self-defense. He fell silent, and that silence made everything clearer. Carter looked at Rudd. For the first time that morning, he felt his suspicion had been aimed in the wrong direction. He glanced at Jonas, then away again. Confusion, obvious. He realized he had chosen the wrong person to unload his anger on. Jonas still stood quietly. He didn't show triumph or relief at being cleared. He only stood there, an unwilling witness to the system uncovering the truth on its own. Hale continued questioning the technician about access permissions, edit, timestamps, and who held administrative roles during that period. Each answer clarified the picture, and with each clarification, Rudd's room to explain narrowed. Rudd heard every word. He understood Hale didn't need to question Jonas to know what was happening. Not questioning was Hale's way of saying the focus was not the janitor. An older SEAL whispered to his teammate that this was the first time he'd seen the person most suspected of the one not questioned. The teammate didn't respond, only looked at Jonas, then at Rudd, his expression shifting. Hale asked the technician to pause the display to summarize the information. The screen switched to standby. He turned to the officers, ordering the lockdown to remain until further instructions. His voice was procedural, but his gaze remained sharp. Jonas was told to stay where he was, not out of suspicion, out of procedure. He nodded once, saying nothing. Carter stepped back into the line. He didn't look at Jonas again. The earlier frustration had shifted into something heavier, like shame lodged in his chest. Rudd stood alone now, feeling clearly the change in how people looked at him. The eyes that once carried automatic respect now held caution. He understood he was at the center of the question, even if no one asked him outright. Hale stepped one pace toward Rudd, not too close, but close enough to create pressure. He said he needed to clarify Rudd's role in maintaining the account. The sentence was professional, not accusatory, but the implication couldn't be mistaken. Rudd nodded, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, wanted to regain control with words, but found no footing. All the data pointed away from him. Jonas watched with a calm that was hard to explain. He had seen similar moments in the past, when a system or an order accidentally dragged someone into the light. He knew that feeling, though he did not say so. Hale ended the preliminary review, asking the technician to save all logs for further investigation. He turned to Rudd one last time, his eyes lingering a beat longer. Rudd said nothing. He had no words left that fit. His silence now was no longer a choice. It was an outcome. The room fell silent again. This time, the silence placed its entire weight on one person, and Rudd understood that when the one not being questioned was the safest person in the room, the other was standing dangerously close to a boundary not easily undone. After Hale's words in the previous section, the room seemed held inside a long breath. Everyone stood still, but this silence was different from the earlier lockdowns. It no longer carried the sense of waiting for protocol, but felt like waiting for something long overdue to be named. Hale turned back to the screen. He said nothing as he used the mouse to scroll the report to its beginning. Pages of data appeared, neatly organized by time, the letters clean, showing no signs of disruption. That neatness was exactly what made a few people feel a chill down their spine. Hale stopped at a date. He pointed directly at it and said slowly, "That training session." The sentence was clear enough for everyone to hear, yet it did not explain. A senior SEAL standing near the lockers tilted his head slightly. His eyes lingered on that date longer than the others. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself. "I remember that day." His voice did not tremble, but something heavy settled in its tone. A few people turned to him. No one asked anything further, but recognition had already begun to spread. That training session was not just another anonymous day on the schedule. It had once been mentioned, then gradually faded out of hallway conversations. The technician continued working under Hale's direction. He opened the archived version of the report and placed it beside the current one. The two documents were nearly identical, hard to distinguish unless examined closely. He pointed at several lines and said, "The report was edited." His voice carried no accusation, but everyone understood the edits were not typos. Carter stood nearby, his eyes moving quickly between the screen and Rudd. He had been silent until now, but this time, the question escaped before he could weigh it. "You signed it?" he asked, turning fully toward Rudd, his voice no longer sharp, but stunned. Rudd looked at Carter, then at Hale, then down at the floor. He inhaled and answered slowly, each word measured. Under orders at the time, the answer was not long, but it added another layer of fog to the matter. Hale did not react immediately. He kept his eyes on Rudd, unchanged and unwavering. Then he asked, his voice still low and steady, "Whose orders?" The question was simple, but it hung in the air like a weight. Rudd opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at the screen where the date still glowed, then at the faces waiting for his answer. He stayed silent. The silence lasted longer than a normal pause, long enough for everyone to understand. It wasn't hesitation. It was a dead end. No one pushed him. No one spoke to fill the gap. The room collectively understood that some questions, once asked, no longer needed answers to prove their existence. Hale turned back to the screen and continued flipping through the report. He read faster now, but still paused at any section showing signs of editing. Small details began lining up: the timing, the content, the signature at the bottom. With each page turned, the sense that this wasn't a single mistake grew stronger. Another SEAL whispered to the person next to him that the training session had ended abruptly. The other nodded, saying he remembered too, but at the time, no clear reason had been given. The scattered pieces of memory began finding their way back. Jonas stood off to the side. He wasn't mentioned, nor was he called again. But when that date was read, his expression shifted slightly. He didn't look at the screen, but at the space before him, as if staring through time. He didn't speak, but his presence now carried another depth. The technician added that the original report included an appendix, but that appendix was missing from the main system. He said traces of it remained in the edit history, but its content had been removed. Several people inhaled sharply, as if realizing they had just glimpsed a locked room whose door had been shut long ago. Hale asked what the appendix was concerned with. The technician replied that the remaining data suggested it was related to the cause of injury and the post-training response time. He added that this type of information was usually highly sensitive, and removing it required high-level clearance. Carter looked at Rudd again. His eyes no longer carried challenge, but confusion. He understood that the man before him was not just a deputy commander being questioned, but someone who had once decided with consequences stretching into the present. Rudd stood straight, but his shoulders had begun to sink. He didn't deny anything, nor try to redirect the topic. He knew every word now would be weighed against the data appearing on the screen. Hale asked about the accident protocol. A training officer responded that full reporting and an independent assessment were required. Hale asked if that protocol had been applied to this session. The officer hesitated, then said that according to the current records, there was no evidence that an independent assessment had been carried out. Silence returned, heavier than before. It was no longer the silence of individuals, but the silence of a group realizing that a gap had existed among them for years. Another senior SEAL spoke, his voice deep, saying that after that training session, there had been a long period when no one mentioned the injured trainee's name. He said that at the time, everyone had been told to focus on upcoming missions, and the story slowly fell out of collective memory. No one contradicted him. Hale looked around the room, his gaze stopping briefly on each face. He no longer needed to ask to understand that what was being revealed wasn't just data. It was a death handled, internally, wrapped in carefully edited lines. Rudd finally looked up. He looked at Hale, then Jonas, then down again. He said quietly that at the time, there had been pressure from above, from training deadlines, from the need to keep the unit stable. His words sounded like a late explanation, not enough to lighten the weight of what had just come to light. Hale did not react immediately. He let the words settle, then turned back to the screen, pointing at the signature at the bottom of the report. Without further explanation, everyone understood its meaning. That signature was the period ending a process, and the beginning of years of silence. Jonas shifted slightly. He didn't step forward, but the small movement was enough for Hale to notice. The two shared a glance. No words passed, but there was an understanding something had been seen from another angle. Long ago, Carter exhaled slowly, as if realizing his earlier anger had blinded him to what truly mattered. He said nothing more, Every question now felt unnecessary. Hale concluded that the training session must be fully reviewed. He said the system had just revealed that a death had never been properly locked away. His voice held no accusation, but it closed every remaining doubt. The room fell silent. No one denied it. No one objected. The truth, though not spoken fully, was already present. Rudd stood there with nowhere left to retreat. He understood that from this moment on, the story would not stop at a report or an old training session, and everyone in the room understood that they were facing the consequences of a death that had never truly been dealt with. The preliminary review ended without any formal announcement. The gym remained under lockdown, but the tension had shifted direction. Eyes no longer searched the screens for more evidence, nor did they sneak glances at Jonas as before. Attention had strangely left him, as if someone had decided he no longer belonged inside the usual circle of suspicion. Hale signaled an officer to take over maintaining order, then turned to Jonas. He didn't call his name, only tilted his head slightly, enough for Jonas to understand he needed to follow. No one stopped them. No one asked questions. This exchange was accepted from the start as something that shouldn't happen in front of a crowd. They walked along the rear hallway behind the gym, a place rarely used. The noise from inside faded, replaced by a heavy, quiet. Hale walked ahead, his steps steady, unrushed. Jonas followed, keeping a careful distance. He didn't ask where they were going. He was used to being led into conversations whose content was already decided before the door closed. Hale stopped at a small room used for quick meetings. He opened the door, stepped inside, then turned to wait for Jonas. The room was empty, with only a long table and a few chairs pushed against the wall. The white lights revealed scratches on the tabletop, signs of hurried discussions that had taken place here before. The door closed behind them. No recording devices, no one else in the room. Hale leaned against the table, arms crossed for a moment before letting them fall. Jonas stood across from him, not sitting down. He set his broom neatly in a corner, a habit hard to shed, as if he still needed to keep his familiar role present in the space. Hale spoke first. His voice was low, steady, without the authority of a commander giving orders. "I need you to step forward." The sentence was short, clear, with no detours. Jonas didn't seem surprised. He looked at Hale, his expression calm. "I've been standing long enough," he replied. His voice carried neither weariness nor bitterness. It was the voice of someone who had thought about this answer for a long time. Hale nodded slightly, as if he had expected that response. He stepped aside, looking down at the table for a moment before continuing. "This truth will keep going." The sentence didn't sound like a warning, but like an obvious fact being stated again. Jonas lowered his eyes to the floor. He looked at a scratch near his shoe, where the paint had worn off. "I know," he said. 2 words were enough to close an entire chain of memories he did not want to name. Hale looked back at Jonas. His eyes no longer held the focus of someone uncovering an old file. They carried hesitation, something rare in people accustomed to decisive choices. "Then why don't you speak?" Hale asked. The question came slowly, as if he was also asking himself. Jonas stayed silent for a beat. He inhaled, then exhaled, evenly. "Because every time it's reopened," he said, pausing briefly before continuing. "Someone new pays the price." His voice was lower, but not louder. There was no accusation in it, only recognition. Hale didn't counter. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Familiar scenarios rose in his mind: formal investigations, supplementary reports, responsibilities assigned to their proper places. But at the same time, he saw the chain of consequences that would follow. The people who would be pulled into the spiral of a past dragged back into the present. Jonas lifted his head and looked at Hale. "You think I don't want to speak?" he asked, his voice steady. "I've said enough, just not today." Hale leaned forward, bracing his hands on the table. He looked at Jonas for a long moment. He understood that the man standing before him wasn't just a witness. Jonas carried a piece of history the system could never record fully, a part that, if exposed, would not stop at truth alone. "Rudd will have to answer for this," Hale said, as if testing another direction. "What he did can't be ignored." Jonas nodded. "I know," he said, "and he will." He paused, then added, "He doesn't need me to make that happen." That sentence left Hale silent. He realized Jonas wasn't denying the need for clarity. He was rejecting the role Hale was trying to place on him, a role that would make Jonas the spark for a process he knew too well. Hale walked a few steps in the room, then stopped at the small window looking out into the hallway. He said that in his career, he had seen many truths buried for reasons labeled necessary. He said he didn't want to become someone who continued that pattern. Jonas listened, not interrupting. When Hale stopped, Jonas spoke. "I'm not telling you to bury it," Jonas said. "I just don't want to be the one holding the shovel." Hale turned back to him. The sentence wasn't a challenge, but it placed Hale in front of an uncomfortable reality. Jonas wasn't avoiding the truth. He refused to become its emblem. "You know this won't stop here," Hale said. Jonas nodded again. "It never stopped," he replied. "Today it just knocked on the door." A long silence settled between them. No ticking clock, no background noise, just two men in a small room, each carrying a different responsibility for the same story. Hale eventually exhaled slowly. He said he respected Jonas's decision, even if he didn't agree with it. He said Jonas's refusal didn't lessen the weight of what had just been uncovered. Jonas picked up the broom, rotating the handle lightly as if preparing to return to his work. "I don't need you to agree," he said. "I just need you to understand." Hale looked at Jonas, then nodded. Not the nod of a superior to a subordinate, but of someone acknowledging the limits of his own role in this moment. Jonas turned toward the door. He opened it, pausing for a brief beat, as if considering whether to say more. Then he stepped out, leaving Hale alone in the room. The door closed softly. Hale remained still, his eyes fixed on the space where Jonas had been. He understood that this conversation would never appear in any record, never enter any official report, but it would haunt every decision he made next. Out in the hallway, Jonas walked with his familiar stride. He didn't look back. The decision he had just made closed one door, but opened consequences he knew he couldn't control. And behind the door that had just closed, Hale remained standing, facing a choice no longer as simple as it seemed at the start. Hale returned to the meeting room without bringing Jonas back. The rear door closed behind him, leaving a gap more noticeable than any presence. A few people realized it immediately. That absence wasn't loud, but it shifted the rhythm of the space. Carter was the first to see it. He stood near the door, waiting out of reflex, then realized Jonas was not walking in behind Hale. Carter's eyes swept quickly along the hallway, then back to the meeting room. He stepped closer to Hale, lowered his voice, just enough not to break the order. "What did he say?" Carter asked, the question slipping out with more uncertainty than he wanted to show. Hale didn't stop walking. He set the file on the table, pulled out a chair, and only then answered. He didn't say anything. His voice was steady, without implication, but that honesty made the answer heavier. Carter froze for a beat. He didn't ask more. That answer was enough for him to understand the conversation hadn't gone the way he imagined. He stepped back into his place, his eyes no longer searching for Jonas. The meeting room wasn't large, but it felt cramped when everyone sat down. Chairs were pulled out, metal scraping the floor here and there. Hale sat at the head of the table with the file placed in front of him. He didn't open it right away. He let the room settle first, as if everyone needed another few seconds to adjust to the fact that Jonas was no longer here. Rudd sat on the opposite side, separated from the others by just enough space, so no one had to dodge his gaze. A reprinted report lay in front of him. The pen was neatly placed to the right, but his hand didn't reach for it. His fingers trembled slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough for him to feel it. Hale began by summarizing what the system had shown. He didn't mention the tattoo. He didn't mention Jonas. He talked about data, about timestamps, about edit points. Every sentence was kept at an operational level, yet no one in the room heard it as just a procedural report anymore. A SEAL sitting near Rudd leaned toward a teammate and whispered very softly, "If it's not him, then the only one left is..." The sentence was left hanging, but the meaning was clear. The other man didn't respond. He just looked at Rudd, and then looked away. Rudd heard it. He clenched his jaw, then spoke, his voice raspier than usual. "Enough." The word came out quickly, like a reflex of self-defense. The room went quiet for a brief beat. Hale looked at Rudd, neither reproachful nor surprised. He waited another beat, then continued. He said the current report did not reflect what actually happened during that training session. He said they needed a correct version, no edits, no omissions. Rudd lowered his gaze to the papers before him. He turned the first page, then the next. Every page was familiar. He had read them many times, signed them years ago. Back then, he had signed quickly, under directives, under the context of that moment. This time, the pen in his hand felt heavier. Carter watched with a strange feeling. He had once believed responsibility always came with power, that people in positions like Rudd's would always find a way to maneuver. But right now, Rudd did not look like someone in control. He looked like a man being forced to look back at himself. Hale added that Jonas had refused to come forward. He didn't explain why. He simply said the decision had been respected. That sentence made a few people look up. Jonas's silence, in this context, became an invisible pressure pushing everything back into its rightful place. Another officer asked whether correcting the report would be enough. Hale replied that it was the first step. His voice offered no promises. He didn't speak of consequences, but everyone understood they would come. Rudd reached for the pen. His hand trembled more clearly now. He placed the tip on the page, then stopped. He looked up at Hale as if wanting to say something, but Hale's eyes didn't invite excuses. "You can add your own comments in an appendix," Hale said, his tone calm, "but the main content needs to be correct." Rudd nodded slowly. He looked back at the report, reading each line again. The sentences, once crafted to soften the event, now clearly showed their lack of honesty. He lifted the pen and corrected a section, then stopped again. His breath grew heavier. An older SEAL stood up and asked permission to step outside. Hale nodded. No one stopped him. The air in the room was heavy enough that some people needed space simply to breathe. Carter looked at Rudd, then at Hale. He suddenly understood why Jonas had kept silent. There was no need for anyone to accuse, no need for condemnation. When the truth was placed in the right spot, it forced those involved to face it on their own. Rudd eventually began to write. New lines appeared on the page, slow, careful. He wrote down what had been omitted, what had once been phrased differently. Each sentence was like peeling off a layer he had relied on for years. Hale watched without pressuring. He allowed the process to unfold at Rudd's pace. This wasn't an interrogation. It was a moment of choice. When Rudd finished writing, he set the pen down and looked at the final page. The space for the signature was blank. He lingered there for a long moment. His hand trembled, then gradually steadied. He lifted the pen again. A few people held their breath. No one spoke. No one needed to. Rudd signed his name. The handwriting wasn't neat, not as even as before, but it was clear. This signature was not altered. Hale looked at the signature, then gave a small nod. There was no announcement, no applause, only a quiet acknowledgement that something had been completed and something else was about to begin. Rudd set the pen down and leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. His gaze was empty, as if he had just passed through a doorway he knew he could never return through. The room remained silent. This silence was no longer vague. It carried conclusions and consequences. Somewhere out in the hallway, Jonas was continuing his work. He did not know, or did not need to know, that inside the meeting room, the signature just placed on the page had locked away a part of the past while opening the way to a new chain of consequences. And in that room, with every gaze still lingering on the signature, whose ink had not yet dried, no one dared say that this was over. The afternoon passed without any announcement being released outside the base. No press briefing, no internal email, no notice was posted in the hallway. Everything unfolded so quietly that if someone had not been in the meeting room when the signature was placed, they might have thought the morning had been just a small glitch, already handled neatly. The incident report was completed in silence. Hale read it one last time, then nodded for it to be archived. In the conclusion line, the wording was chosen carefully. Nothing extra, nothing missing. The incident was caused by a system error. That line sat neatly at the bottom of the page, like a lid fitted onto a box no one wanted to open again. No one objected. No one suggested changing the wording. Those present understood this was the only form of closure the organization would accept. The full truth had been sent through another route. What remained was for the official record. The systems technician stood beside the table, looking at the report once more. He lowered his voice and told Hale they had reviewed the entire physical and digital archive. "We didn't find the card." The statement was delivered as a report, without speculation. Hale didn't immediately lift his head. He looked at the line on the paper, then answered, "Because it was never deleted." His voice was calm, as if stating a procedure already confirmed. The response made the technician pause for a beat, then nod. No further explanation was needed. The old file was sealed and marked according to procedure. A copy was prepared to be sent to command. No lengthy cover letter, no recommendations, only data, signatures, and timestamps. Hale signed the final confirmation, closed the file, and handed it to the liaison officer in charge. Meanwhile, Rudd was informed he could leave the base that day. No ceremony, no formal farewell. The decision was made, and the rest belonged to the next administrative layers. Rudd packed up his belongings in his small office. Personal items were placed into a cardboard box, one at a time. Slowly, he paused in front of a group photo hanging on the wall. A very brief moment. Then he took it down and set it face down in the box. No one witnessed it. No one needed to. Rudd stepped into the hallway carrying the box. A few people stood, not far away, but no one approached. They watched him with cautious eyes, not gloating, not pitying. It was the look given to someone leaving a position he no longer had the right to return to. A security camera captured the moment the front door closed behind Rudd. The door shut slowly, the hinge giving off a very soft sound. The image was stored according to procedure, time-stamped, coded, and then placed into the long queue of footage that would never be reviewed again. No one stood at the exit to see him off. Rudd walked away, back straight, step steady, but each one seemed heavier than the last. He didn't look back. Some things, once closed, do not need to be seen again. Inside the base, the daily rhythm gradually returned to normal. Areas were unlocked in sequence. The gym was allowed to reopen at the end of the day. Some people went back to finish their interrupted workout. Daily conversations resumed, though with a slight hesitation still lingering in their voices. Jonas continued his work as usual. He wiped the floors in the back hallway, where few people passed. No one called him over to ask anything else. No one asked him to sign any document. The silence around him held a different meaning now, not suspicion, not indifference. Carter saw Jonas from a distance. He stopped for a beat, then turned away, not to avoid him, but because he didn't yet know what to say. He understood that the questions he had asked that morning had gone in the wrong direction, and that understanding left him more unsettled than being reprimanded would have. Hale ended his workday later than usual. He stood in his office, looking out at the parking lot thinning out. The file had been sent. The report is archived. On paper, everything had closed. An officer stepped in, asking if additional instructions were needed for tomorrow. Hale shook his head, saying everything would continue according to the training schedule. His voice revealed nothing else. The officer nodded and left. In the tech room, the system was checked one last time before switching to night monitoring. Logs were compressed and sorted. The line of data about the old access card sat quietly in a deep directory, not flagged, not mentioned again. A young technician looked at the screen and asked a colleague whether any more traces needed to be removed. The colleague replied no, because everything was already within protocol. That answer ended the exchange. No one spoke the card's name again. It disappeared from conversations, from hallway questions, from early guesses. It existed in its own way, not in a drawer, not in the physical system, but in the space between decisions already made. Hale left his office and walked down the long hallway. The lights switched off automatically behind him. He paused briefly at the gym door. Looking inside through the small window, Jonas was there, cleaning the remaining marks from the afternoon workout. His movements were slow, steady, familiar. Hale stood still, not knocking. He had no reason to enter. The necessary conversation had already happened. What needed to be said had been said in a way that required no recording. Outside, the sky darkened. The base sank into its nighttime rhythm, where activities narrowed to only the required watch shifts. Cameras kept recording. The system kept running. New data layered over the old. Somewhere in storage, the file of that training day rested quietly, now carrying the real signature. In another place, the conclusion reading, "The incident was caused by a system error," sat in today's report. The two things existed in parallel, no contradiction, no overlap. Jonas ended his shift later than usual. He put away the tools, washed his hands, and then exited through the side door as he did every day. No one noticed. No one stopped him. He walked out into the dark, where the base became only a block of light behind him. Hale stood at an upstairs window, watching that silhouette for a very brief moment. He knew that on paper, this story was over, but he also knew some things do not end the way people write them, and somewhere in the system, deeper than any named directory, the trace of the card still existed unnamed, undeleted, waiting for another moment to remind them it had once been there. The next morning, the gym opened on time as if nothing had happened. The lights came on according to schedule, the machines powered up, and the familiar atmosphere returned. The early arrivals walked in with their old rhythm, carrying their old habits, but their eyes were no longer the same. Jonas was there early. He cleaned the floor near the entrance area, his movements slow and steady, as every day. The broom passed through each small section, gathering the dirt left from the day before. No one asked him to change his routine, and no one mentioned it yesterday. That normalcy was not forgetfulness, but a collective choice. A few SEALs walked in, nodding to Jonas. Some responses were returned. Some were only glances. No one asked anything else. No one joked as before. The usual conversations still happened, but the voices were lower, more cautious. Carter arrived a bit later than usual. He paused at the threshold, looking into the gym before stepping inside. Everything looked familiar, but the feeling in his chest was not like other mornings. He saw Jonas in the distance, bent over, cleaning the floor near the lockers. Carter didn't go straight to the training area. He waited, hands clasping and unclasping, his discomfort visible in every small gesture. He had thought about this moment since last night about what he should say, then thought that maybe he shouldn't say anything at all. Jonas looked up when he heard footsteps stop. He looked at Carter, his expression calm. He didn't call his name or ask why he was standing there. He simply continued his work, as if giving Carter more time to decide for himself. Carter cleared his throat. "Yesterday, I was wrong," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. The words came out unevenly, as if he wasn't used to saying them. Jonas stopped, straightened up. He looked at Carter, neither judging nor dismissing. "Yeah," he replied, a short word, carrying neither forgiveness nor reproach. It sounded like an acknowledgement that the statement had been heard. Carter bowed his head slightly. "I thought I understood things," he went on, "but I was looking in the wrong place." He paused, then added, "I'm sorry." Jonas didn't answer immediately. He bent down, picked up Carter's neck towel that had fallen to the floor at some point. He dusted it off lightly, then handed it back. A simple, familiar gesture, as if he had done this many times for many others. Carter took the towel, gripping it tightly. He waited, unsure whether he should say more or stop. Jonas looked at him, his voice slow, low, each word spoken without emphasis. "Contempt creates mistakes." He paused for a beat, letting the words settle, then added, "Respect saves lives." Carter stood still. The sentence wasn't a lecture, nor a reprimand. It felt like a truth spoken from experience, beyond arguing. "Thank you," Carter said after a moment, "not for the towel, but for the words." Jonas gave a slight nod, then returned to the broom. Those nearby didn't pretend to see. They watched, then looked away, each carrying their own thoughts. No one laughed. No one commented. The moment was allowed to pass naturally. The gym grew busier. The sound of weights hitting the floor, the hum of machines, the rhythm of heavy breaths. Everything fell back into place. But in the way people moved, there was a small adjustment, as if they were more aware of distance, of words, of the things they once took for granted. Hale walked through the gym while checking the areas. He didn't stop. His gaze passed over Jonas and Carter, then moved on. He didn't need to intervene. Some changes require no orders. Rudd was no longer there. His chair in meetings would be filled by someone else. His name would appear in administrative transitions, then fade from everyday conversation. It didn't need to be stated for people to understand. The file had been sent. The report is archived. Those things belonged to the system. What remained belonged to how people looked at one another. Jonas finished the cleaning area, pushed the equipment cart to its usual corner. He washed his hands, dried them, then stood for a moment looking at the gym. He wasn't looking for anything specific. He simply stood there, as part of the space. Carter tied his neck towel again and entered the training area. He started stretching, his movements slower than usual. Another SEAL asked about his workout for the day. Carter answered briefly, then continued. He didn't bring up yesterday. No need. At the entrance area, a SEAL swiped his card. The scanner beeped, short and clear. This time, valid. The door opened smoothly. No alarms, no warning lights. People walked in without thinking twice. Jonas glanced toward the door for a brief moment. He heard the sound, noticing the small difference that only those paying close attention would catch. Then he turned away, picked up the broom again, and continued his work. The day went on. No summary announcement, no official reminder. But those present carried something else with them hard to name, yet enough to change the way they stepped into the gym each morning. The incident had been pushed down, but what remained wasn't on paper, nor in the system. It was in moments like this, when someone bowed their head to admit fault, when someone else chose to say just enough, and when the sound of a card scanner beeped valid, like everything was running in the right place. And there, in the restored normalcy, the memory of yesterday morning didn't disappear. It lingered quietly, a reminder that truth, even buried, leaves traces in the way people treat one another. Jonas's story reminds us that injustice often begins with prejudice and contempt. When people take out their anger and power on someone weaker, mistakes happen easily. Respect isn't just politeness, it's what keeps us from making rash decisions and needless tragedies. The story also shows that truth can be covered by reports, signatures, or systems, but it rarely disappears completely. A mistake that isn't handled properly leaves long-lasting consequences, and eventually, it comes back, even through a very small trace. From Jonas's choice to stay silent, we understand that morality isn't always black and white. There are moments to speak up and moments to hold back, but every decision must come from responsibility toward people. not from fear or personal gain. From a story in a gym, the lesson expands to society in any organization. If truth is pushed down and the vulnerable are used as sacrifices, the price will come sooner or later. If this story made you think, share it so more people can learn from it. Thank you for following along, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue with the next thoughtful and inspiring stories.